and welcome to the Danube Institute. Tonight, we'll hear about a certain legitimacy crisis in Ireland from our guest lecturer, Michael Walsh. Mr. Walsh is an acclaimed author, a journalist, a musician, and a screenwriter. He was for 16 years the main music critic and foreign correspondent for Time magazine, for which he covered the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. His works include the novels As Time Goes By and All the Saints, which was a winner in 2004 for the American Book Award for Fiction. Michael Walsh was also a visiting fellow at Boston University, and he has lectured widely both in the US and abroad, including presentations in Tokyo, Japan, Munich, and here in Budapest at our institute. He also wrote for National Review. Part-time, he lives in Ireland, where he has restored his family home in County Clare. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming him on the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I add my welcome to one you've already received from Christina. I'm John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute, an old friend of Michael's, and somebody who has a much less distinguished record in relation to Ireland than I can claim, but nonetheless have worked there and lived there at times. Now, until recently, I'll say a few words about the topic. Until recently, there was a generally accepted progressive narrative, at least on the left, about the development and future of Ireland. Following the Troubles and the Good Friday Settlement, it held that because of the scandals in the church, Ireland was throwing off a Catholic identity and moving towards the EU model of social progressivism. In a fundamentally post-religious country, Ireland remained divided between the nationalist south and the unionist north, linked to Britain, but the issue of a united Ireland had been put on the back burner, at least for the moment. The major political movements seemed to be adapting to European progressive norms, both major parties. A gradual evolution of Catholic Ireland, with the legalization of divorce and abortion and a decline in church attendance on Sundays, continued. The rise in prosperity, rooted both in trade and market access to the EU and in multinational direct investment, resulting in low business taxation, those things continued, were foundations of the new society. All of these different trends seemed to blend into a general impression of a country that had become a standard, modern, progressive European one. Under the surface, though, new trends were upsetting the apple cart. I will quickly list a few. First, under the radar, mass immigration was transforming Irish society demographically, with an especially problematic impact on poorer and marginalised Irish communities. Secondly, Ireland's membership of the EU, generally beneficial, began to clash with its welcome of foreign direct investment, especially from America. After all, Brussels elites don't want tax competition between different EU countries because it may limit their power to raise taxes. Ireland's culturally progressive trends, driven at least as much by the media as by the government, began to be resented by the still majority Catholic population, who increasingly felt left behind and detached from the major political parties. Increasingly, politics seemed to be something that was for the people and perhaps to the people, but neither by nor of the people. This separation of the populace took clear administrative form when Sinn Féin, a party linked to the Irish Republican Army that had conducted terrorism in the north, won the single largest number of votes in an election and forced what had been the two major parties until that time, forced them to form a grand coalition in order to keep Sinn Féin out of power and themselves in. Having a post-terrorist party so close to power was obviously embarrassing, and internally was something of a threat to the police and intelligence services, who had waged a battle against them during the Troubles. But the Grand Coalition itself seemed to have a dubious relationship to democracy. It signified that the gap was growing between what the voters wanted and what the government thought was prudent. That became embarrassingly clear when the government lost two important constitutional amendments intended to demonstrate that Ireland's modern progressivism was now the national ethos, from which there could be no going back. As it turned out, the government lost both amendments by very large 2-1, 3-1 majorities. Those failures discredited not only the political parties, but also the large collection of NGOs. There are several thousand in Ireland, a small country. And that had support, all the NGOs had themselves strongly supported the Constitution. Catholic Ireland had not evaporated, however, completely. Women voted in large numbers to reject amendments drafted and proposed by feminist NGOs. Conservative-minded independent MPs organised campaigns from scratch to defend the country's 1937 constitution with its conservative character. And in the presidential election only less than 2 weeks ago, the Grand Coalition parties had to manoeuvre to prevent a tradition-minded conservative woman lawyer being on the ballot on the grounds that if she were on the ballot, she'd probably be elected. So they then suffered a particularly embarrassing blow when the woman was excluded. A large number of people actually spoiled their ballot papers by writing her name on it. And then their candidates were defeated by a candidate supported by various independent, left-wing, various fringe groups, including Sinn Féin, whose candidate was elected. A final result of all these developments is that a newly energized Sinn Féin now wants a strong national push to bring about a united Ireland, which the coalition parties would like to euthanize as quickly as possible. Now I think we're hearing from Michael tonight what will be a well-informed, original, and imaginative analysis of this very extraordinary, confused situation. We're delighted to have him here this last week or two as a distinguished fellow who's been giving a series of wonderful lectures, including 3 of them with his own accompaniment on the piano. And from my conversations with Michael, I gather he will be proposing some revolutionary ideas. I should warn him, therefore, that the moderator tonight is an Ulster Unionist, so we may get some fireworks. Michael, many thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Melissa O'Sullivan. Thank you, Danube Institute, for having me back for, I think, the 3rd or 4th time since we started all of this. And thank you for coming, the audience. We're going to talk about Ireland today. And in 1973, I got on an airplane in England and flew to Ireland. It was the country that my great-grandmother on my father's side had emigrated from around 1880-something. We don't know exactly when. But she came over on the boat. She met a man from the same county, County Clare. Those of you who know where Clare is, you can see it quite clearly on the map there. It's where the famous Cliffs of Moher are. It's where the Aran Islands are right off the coast. It's beautifully scenic, quite wild, and quite rugged. And she went to Boston, Massachusetts, as so many of them did, and wound up working in the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. Many of the Irish girls in those days, and more Irish girls came over than Irish men. which is interesting. It's generally the other way around during the height of European emigration to America. She worked in the mills weaving textiles. As I mentioned, many of the Irish girls did that. They did it in England. They went to Leeds, for example, and in the Midlands. They went to Canada. They went to Australia, some of them not willingly, of course, but they went. And there she met a man from County Clare, and they got married and had 6 or 7 children and amassed some property and built themselves a house in Malden, Massachusetts. And she learned English. I should say this right off the bat. She didn't speak English when she came over. She spoke Irish, Asqueiliga, as we say in Ireland. And she dropped that immediately and adopted English as her language. And none of her children learned to speak Irish. But that's what immigrants did in those days. You turned your back on the old country and you now embraced your new life as a citizen in a new land. So in 1973, at the age of 24, I just turned 24, I went to Europe and I decided I would go to Ireland to see for myself what it was all about. And so I flew over on a flight from England. And when we landed in Ireland, the pilot said, I'll never forget this, "Welcome to Ireland. Please set your clocks back 400 years." I think it was meant as a joke, but somehow the Irish never quite take it that way. And I thought, well, what an odd thing to say, because of course it brings up the whole fraught relationship between Britain and Ireland, which is Britain's first colony and also its last colony. And it's been that way for almost 1,000 years. So this is a very long-standing, uncomfortable relationship. It's been tremendously beneficial in some ways. It's been tremendously damaging in other ways. And I need not go through the litany of grievances at this point. But to say that the initial invasion of Ireland was around 1170 when, as usual in Ireland, one of the local potentates, Ireland's never been a country, by the way, it still isn't, invited the newly landed Normans in Britain to come to Ireland and sort out a fight he was having with some rival dukes and earls. And the English never left. So once there, they established headquarters in and around Dublin and something called the Pale of Settlement, which was largely Anglo-Norman. And beyond that were the original native Celtic inhabitants who had different customs, dressed differently, different social organization, different languages, obviously. And gradually, the English influence extended over the whole of Ireland, and certainly by the time of Queen Elizabeth, it became the dominant influence. And by the beginning of the 19th century, Ireland was essentially annexed to the kingdom of Great Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. That lasted until various liberation movements of the 19th century and into the 20th century. And many of you here, even in Hungary, are certainly familiar with the famous Easter Rising, in which some Irish rebels took advantage of Britain's preoccupation in World War I to try a quixotic attempt to overthrow the British establishment in Ireland. It failed, and most of them were executed. One who wasn't was Eamon de Valera, who was spared by the Brits because he had been born in New York City. So he was an American citizen, and it was felt that to execute an American citizen in the middle of World War I, where the Americans were going to turn out to be key to ending that war, was not the best political move possible. So they spared him. And eventually, he wound up leading the country through its formative years. So we had this abortive revolution, and then we had an actual revolution, again, taking advantage of English military weakness in post-World War I to wrest the country and turn it into what eventually became the modern Republic of Ireland. With a couple of stops along the way, we became the Irish Free State, which was sort of like being Canada. It was a part of the overall Commonwealth, but you still swore fealty to the monarch in London. That was replaced in just after World War II, again taking advantage of British weakness from the Second World War, when Ireland declared itself independent and sovereign and it became the Republic of Ireland. Now, John's mentioned the 6 counties, and again, that's too complex to go into, but as part of the original separation from Britain, there was allowed that some counties could opt out of the new Free State of Ireland, and 6 of them in the north, the top part there, except for Donegal, opted out. And each of those counties had Protestant majorities. Those majorities come from the so-called plantation of Ireland, in which the English didn't settle Ireland. They brought Scots Presbyterians to settle Ireland. And it's interesting that Scotland itself is named after Ireland. Queen Scotia was an Irish queen who basically went to Scotland, and then the land was named after her. So we consider the Scots kind of our younger, stupider brothers, basically. But the Scots settled that, and they became known as the Scots-Irish. And many of them went to the United States. So those of you who have been to the United States know that they centered in what's now Appalachia. So West Virginia, Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee. They're a fighting culture. Jim Webb, who was former Secretary of Defense, wrote a book called Born Fighting. It's about the Scots-Irish. They're very prickly and difficult to subdue. So they established a very typically American attitude in the middle of a new land. When the famine strikes in the 1840s, many of the Irish become overwhelmingly Catholic as emigres. Many of the first handful of presidents could trace their ancestry back to the so-called Scots-Irish, but it wasn't until John F. Kennedy, the anniversary of whose assassination was yesterday, November 22nd, 1963. Until JFK, there had never been an Irish Catholic president. That was for reasons of religious prejudice and also a certain lingering animosity against the way the Irish, as immigrants do, as Europe is finding out again now, change the culture of where they come. So Boston, for example, where my family was located, was a Brahmin intellectual, very sort of high church place. And it was overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of illiterate Irish peasants who didn't speak English, who had no particular marketable skills, who were uneducated because Ireland was oppressed to that extent that under certain of the penal laws, it was forbidden to speak Irish, it was forbidden to educate an Irishman, the priests were outlawed, the priests said mass behind hedgerows, they're called hedgerow priests. So these unwashed suddenly flooded American cities, New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Louisiana. Some people forget this, but New Orleans was the cheapest boat ride you could get from Liverpool or from Queenstown, which is now called Cove. It's part of near Cork in the southeast. It was the longest voyage you could take. It took 6 months. Many of them died. These are the famous coffin ships, which had a terrible attrition rate. Many of the Irish were indentured servants, which was essentially being slave, that you had to work off your indenturedness over a period of years. And even after you had finished it, there was no guarantee that your bondholder would allow you to have freedom. So a lot of Irishmen went to Louisiana and died in the subtropical climate there. They found it very difficult to adapt. And if you've been to Ireland, you know it's cold-ish there. It's always sort of raining and 42 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever time of year it is. But they left their mark. There's a neighborhood in New Orleans called Irish Channel, and it reflects that. San Francisco, California, also a big center of Irishness. And what I think is so striking about the Irish immigration to the New World was, and unlike most European immigration, was that it took a poor, illiterate, non-English speaking population of farmers and turned them into urban lawyers, cops, and gangsters. If there's one thing we were good at, it was crime. And the great Irish gangsters of the late 19th century and early 20th century, y'all have probably seen the movie Gangs of New York that Martin Scorsese directed 20-some years ago. That was a good outline of the conditions that the Irish lived under and developed under. I myself written a novel, which Christina was nice enough to mention, called And All the Saints, which is a first-person fake autobiography of an Irishman, born in Leeds, England, by the way, but a member of the diaspora, whose name was Owen Vincent Madden, and he came to the U.S. as a young boy on a boat. His mother had already come to New York, and he and his older brother and his younger sister, became New Yorkers, and he became the king of the Duke of New York. He was the largest beer brewer in New York. He was Mae West's lover, not a particularly exclusive category, I must say. But he produced all of her shows on Broadway. He produced her films in Los Angeles. He drove a Duesenberg, which was given to him by Batista of Cuba in the 1930s. He bought Packards for cash. He became tremendously successful. He owned the Cotton Club. In fact, he hired Duke Ellington, and that's where Duke Ellington got his start, playing in the Cotton Club. And Lena Horne started off as one of the girls in the chorus line in the Cotton Club. So the Irish made their contribution, again, legitimately. Many of them became lawyers because we're kind of good at talking. Many of them became cops, and the cliche in New York, even today, is all New York City cops are Irish, whether they're black or Jewish or they're Irish. They have this Irish code which involves courage, kind of dumb courage, which is first through the door. The Irish took over the United States Marine Corps. My father is still alive. He's almost 100 years old now. He was at the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir with the Marine Corps, which was right about now in 1950, in which a handful of Marines were surrounded by about 100,000 Chinese who had suddenly attacked them, and they had to fight their way in 30 below zero weather and survive. And Marine officers tend to be heavily Irish. If you go to any meeting of Marine officers, you'll see a preponderance of Irish names, certainly less so now, as the Irish have faded as an influence in the States, but very noticeable. In fact, the Marine Corps is essentially made up of Irish officers and American Indians and Southwestern Hispanics. It's the most meritocratic service in the U.S. military, and those are the three ethnic groups that are especially attracted to it. And my own father's part American Indian as well, so he kind of fits the profile of a Marine officer. So meanwhile, little old Ireland was left at home to go on her way while her exiled children abroad, as we were referred to in the famous Irish Declaration of Independence that accompanied the Easter Rising, went their way and became extremely successful. So you saw the transformation of a poor peasant population, illiterate and uncultured, into a powerful force. And the election of Jack Kennedy in 1960 was kind of the vindication of everything that the Irish had gone through for about 150 years in the United States. Meanwhile, at home, things have not gone so well. So that's what I want to talk about now for the remaining time that we have. I call this a modest proposal after, of course, the famous Jonathan Swift essay, which was the way for the Irish to solve their overpopulation problem and starvation problem during the famine was to eat their babies. This would reduce the population and feed the Irishmen at once. Now, Jonathan Swift was an Anglo-Irishman, a cleric, dean of some cathedral or other in Dublin, I think. And of course, he meant that not seriously. But a modest proposal always has some element of truth to it. What we have in Ireland today is a dysfunctional country that no longer can be supported by the electoral system and its conception. It's 100 years old, basically. Its constitution was written in response, as John mentioned, to external things, mostly British occupation. And the problem it meant to solve is no longer a problem. And that is the Civil War that followed the War of Independence. The short version is there was a treaty with the Brits that some of the Irish revolutionaries supported and some did not. And this was the split between what are now the two principal parties in Ireland. Michael Collins, who was one of the military leaders of the revolution and probably the greatest Irishman of his time, negotiated that treaty, and De Valera was opposed to it. And Collins said when he signed the treaty that he had just signed his death warrant. And sure enough, right after the treaty, Collins was assassinated by another Irishman on the road back to his birthplace in Cork, as a matter of fact. So he died at a young age, in his 30s. But he had been the most effective opponent of the British during the Revolution. One of the things Collins did was to essentially establish terrorism as a means of winning a war. The British were very, very good at intelligence and had infiltrated the Irish revolutionaries to an extraordinary degree. And the Irish are unmatched at being traitors to their own cause, but I should say this in fairness to the English. We will sell out to anybody for nothing. So we had this problem that the British always knew where the Irish Republican Army, the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood, were going to strike. And Collins organized something he called the 12 Apostles. And 12 Apostles were an assassination squad, and on one day they assassinated every member of the British secret intelligence in Dublin. They shot them down in the streets, they shot them at home, they killed them in restaurants. They did it. And that was effectively the end of the Civil War. So as we look at countries today that are going through this, certainly Israel in the Middle East, the Russia-Ukraine war, these tactics have become standardized in part because of what Collins did in the earliest days of the Irish Republic. It can be considered the original sin of the Irish Republic, in fact. The way the Irish government is set up is there's two parties which have now become one party. There's no functional difference between them. Nobody cares about the treaty anymore. If you asked, and we have 3 Irish grandchildren. I don't think our grandchildren, Kate Walsh is sitting in the audience, I don't think they know anything about the treaty, and nor are they ever likely to know anything about the treaty. That's old news. And as John mentioned, the trend towards progressive secularism has taken over Ireland, once the most Catholic country in the world. Now Catholicism is essentially, we're back to hedgerow priests almost. But the church disgraced itself during COVID because it closed the churches. The churches survived hundreds of years of persecution, but couldn't stand to be open for 5 minutes during this ridiculous COVID hoax, to name the name of what it actually was. This ruined the reputation of the Catholic Church in Ireland. I think it put the nail in their coffin. And over the last 10 years or so, successive Irish governments have removed the church from the Constitution, where it was a part of, acknowledged its pivotal role in keeping Irish nationalism alive. They've legalized abortion. They took the proscription against abortion out of the Constitution. That's gone. The first gay prime minister, which we call the Taoiseach, was an exemplar of the legalization of homosexuality and gay marriage. That came next. So one by one, the pillars that had supported the Irish sense of themselves were removed in the names of European progressivism. We have an electoral system which uses the single transferable vote system, which is an invitation to fraud. I'm sure it's used elsewhere. California, from an American perspective, is partly an example of how badly it can go wrong, where in California they don't have political parties competing head-to-head anymore. Everybody goes in the same pot, and the top two finishers have a runoff. Well, it's California, so there are always two Democrats, so there'll never be another Republican elected to the statewide office in California. In Ireland, it's similar, except that the votes somehow, through some strange magic of genetic engineering, wind up getting transferred from one candidate, and then once he's washed out, his or her votes go to another candidate, and it all happens in back rooms, and then miraculously, someone can actually become prime minister and not having won his own election. This is our current Tánaiste, who's the deputy prime minister, a man of no distinction or accomplishment or ability at all, who was deemed elected to his seat in the parliament, actually managed to finish 16th in a field of 15, and yet he became prime minister. So, any boy can grow up to be a president, apparently. We have this system, and as John mentioned, the two parties now are fading, and they can't quite muster an electoral majority by each one by itself. So they've combined into the uniparty, and we have this now Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil split, but they actually just divvy up the swag. I refer to them as the racket, because as I mentioned, if there's one thing the Irish are good at, it's running rackets. Oni Madden knew how to run a racket in New York. Before him, Tammany Hall is the definition of an Irish racket, which is you play to pay, you get along, everybody's friends here. If somebody steps out of line, he gets whacked quietly, but everybody's friends here. So we just keep on keeping on, keep the system going. Since the mass immigration, which started, of course, as the Hungarians know, here, in 2015, when the first wave of so-called Syrian refugees came through the country and were promptly escorted out of the country, we've had a population increase. The population of Ireland was roughly around 4 million, and it's now over 5.5. And so this million new people have come in, not from traditional Western European lands. They're from Central Africa, they're from Afghanistan, they're from Eastern Europe, Romania, Roma Gypsies. Ireland has folded to multiculturalism and diversity in a spectacular way. So the streets are now no longer visibly Irish in Dublin, and many Americans come thinking they're going to see James Joyce, but they actually see someone from Afghanistan instead. Crime has risen. The government does its best to obscure this. It won't report on ethnic breakdowns of crime. Spectacular crimes have occurred. Young girls were stabbed by an Algerian migrant who had been in the country for years. Many times these people have been ordered to leave. They refuse to go. Ireland will not repatriate them. We, in our village in County Clare, have gone from a village of 560 people to a village of about 1,400 or 1,500. all of them Ukrainians, who came in and were planted in our village deliberately by the government. And they do this by suborning the hoteliers who run seasonal hotels. In our part of Ireland, it's very dependent on summer tourism, It's because quite famous. I didn't know that when I was a kid, but it's one of the most famous destinations. And so everyone depends on seasonal tourism. Well, there is no seasonal tourism anymore because those hotels are filled with Ukrainians. The Ukrainians get a very large sum of money every week. You see them lining up at the post office to collect. They can bring their cars. They don't have to register their cars. They don't have to pass any inspections. They don't have to have a driver's license. They don't have to have anything. And they go home for Christmas at our expense. So this has caused a backlash in other parts of the country where the immigrants are non-white. The backlash is even stronger, and where the crime is more spectacular. The Ukrainians are very good, by the way. They don't cause crime. They keep to themselves. You just basically only see them lining up for the dole once a week. Not so in the rest of Ireland. This is causing, as I say, a backlash against the policies of the government. But the thing is, there is no effective way to oppose it. Because of the single transferable vote, because the two parties are essentially one party, and as John mentioned, they did that to keep Sinn Féin, which used to be the Revolutionary Party, out. Well, Sinn Féin, Americans think Sinn Féin is going to be Provo's up Ireland, Brits out, all that. It's now wholly communist and progressive party. It's devoted to diversity. There's no sexual aberration that it doesn't want to propose and enjoy. They are on the far, far left. And anyone in Ireland who opposes any of these social changes is called far right. It's an all-purpose smear that if you say, hey, what about being good old Ireland, what about keeping our traditions, what about keeping our music and our language, no, you're far right, you're a Nazi. So this, as you know, this is discourse now, not only in Ireland, but in the United States, in the wake of the Trump revolution, and in Germany now, too, as well, where the leftist parties form a shield wall against any objection to whatever social program they are proposing. So my proposal is simple. Scrap the whole thing. The Irish Constitution has outlived its usefulness. The problem of the 6 counties remains. And there seems to be no logical reason why the 6 counties should be part of the United Kingdom. There is a historical reason, but we're past that now. That emergency is over. It no longer matters. Those 6 counties that had Protestant majorities are down to 2 counties that have Protestant majorities. Belfast is a lovely city. It has great historical resonance where the Titanic was built. It was one of the most important industrial cities of the United Kingdom in the 19th and 20th centuries. But we have more in common with the 6 counties than we do with any other place. It is very difficult to break through, however, the wall that the government has erected, which is to say that we are now, Ireland is part of Europe, and they have turned their backs on the diaspora. Now, being a diasporan and one of some influence, I find this very interesting, but you find when you go home, the native Irish don't like you at all. There's a huge chasm between the native Irish and the diasporan Irish. Even people like us who have come back, I'm living on my family's land. Our daughter is married to an Irish citizen. I have 3 Irish grandchildren. So we want to find a way to unify Ireland around a cause again and explain to them that it's not part of Europe. Ireland, I believe, should be part of a new Anglosphere. We should annex the 6 counties. I don't know what England is going to do. John will tell me what England's going to do about it, but I suspect nothing, because if you look at Irish history, The Free State was established effectively by fiat. The Republic was established by fiat. And I think the reunification of Ireland would also be met with quiet acceptance. You have to have an honest democratic election. You can't have this transferable vote swapping in back rooms. You have to have political parties that represent the whole spectrum of thought. And as John mentioned, we had 2 times where the government tried to impose something extreme that is taking basically the definition of women out of the Constitution. One of the leaders of these parties believes there's 82 genders. Seriously, we're still, we're very backward in Ireland, and you do have to set your watches back 400 years because they're still talking about climate change and gender dysphoria and transitioning minors. It's hideous, and it has to stop. But it cannot stop until the political system becomes responsive to the will of the people, and it's not. So my argument is to eventually unify the island under a new constitution, not necessarily the American model. I think, for example, the French model is perhaps more suitable, where you have a parliament and a strong president. The Irish president has no power whatsoever. She's just another pretty face, I suppose we could say about her. And then you move on to a new sense of national unity, not with the French, not with the Germans, but with your cousins and brothers and sisters in America, in England, in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand. The fate and the future for Ireland lies with the Anglosphere, not with the Francosphere of Belgium. It lies in the historic blood relationships of the people among themselves. And to even talk about blood relationships now gets you threatened, with the all-purpose smear of bigot, racist, Nazi, and our discourse has degenerated into what essentially has become an exercise in name-calling. But I think that should Ireland see its way to cast off, as Mephistopheles says to Faust in Goethe's Faust Part 1, let the bonds of illusion fall from your eyes and see how the devil is joking with you. I think should Ireland be able to do that, to actually see clearly, stop resenting the diaspora. Remember, they call us plastic patties, and who are you to say we, and go away. If they were to re-embrace their own cousins, and believe me, every single person, even in our rural County Clare neighborhood, has a brother in Canada, a nephew in New Zealand, an aunt in Australia. They all have them. Reconnect yourself on the family level, which the Hungarians have done, I think, so well here, getting through the communist period. When I first came to your country, it was still a communist country. Keeping your language, which is impenetrable to outsiders, a very useful thing, the way Irish used to be, actually. And get a sense of yourself as a people. And for all of our accomplishments in politics and in finance and in Hollywood and on Broadway and in gangland and in the New York City Police Department and the United States Marine Corps, what we're losing to the left, to progressivism, is that notion of who we are as a people. So my modest proposal is simple. You've had this system for 100 years. The fights are over. Collins is dead. De Valera is dead. The two parties are meaningless at this point. They're effectively, basically the Democrat Party in America, but even more radical than the Democrats are now. I don't know what the equivalent would be here in Hungary, but certainly not Fidesz. Cast off all of that, and start over again. Because for the first time in your history, since 1170, you have a chance to become a real country. I say this on my Twitter feed, that the Irish nation is greater than the Irish state. There's 40 million Americans. There's 5 million residents of Ireland, 1 million of whom aren't Irish at all. And that the nation needs to take control of the state in order to preserve the nationhood of Ireland. So that will fall on deaf ears, but that is my modest proposal for Ireland. Thank you very much for listening.
Michael, thank you very much. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Thank you. Well, thank you, Michael. That was, in fact, fresh, original, interesting, with a lot of building on a lot of developments in the world as a whole. I mean, I think, for example, we're looking at an international consensus on a range of issues, which is cracking. The greatest example is the one over the weekend. The climate change conference in Brazil has plainly admitted that it cannot continue along this path. It's actually said that it's going to devote much more time now to not to mitigating climate change, but to adapting to it. Well, if you're adapting to climate change rather than mitigating it, I can't see why there's any continuing hostility to fossil fuels, so it makes no kind of sense. But you can see the criticism of multiculturalism, you can see the criticism of climate change, you can see a kind of consensus, a broad, progressive consensus coming under attack and crumbling at various points. So that, I think, is extremely persuasive. What I want to raise with you is, well, there are people in the audience who will have strong views on this point. It's, you are proposing a dramatic change in one respect. It may not seem dramatic in the sense that a lot of people might be moving towards it, and the heat may have gone out of it in both Dublin, certainly has in the government, of course, and in Belfast. But the fact is that there is, so far, no one has been able to muster a majority in the north for ending the border. I mean, people keep predicting this is going to happen, but it never seems to come about. One reason seems to be that being a Catholic does not necessarily mean you want to get rid of the border, and being a Protestant doesn't mean you necessarily want to keep it. But so the majority, the religious majority, now shrinking, may not mean that the constitutional majority is shrinking too. So how are you going to, what steps of a practical kind would you take to try to bring about this disappearance of the border?
I think there are a number of prominent diasporans and also patriots in Ireland themselves that are working on this issue. And the question is, how do you do it? When the system is rigged against you, I call it the racket with a capital R. And it consists of three things. One is the governmental electoral system, which literally prevents outsiders. If John and I have too much to drink tonight and decide we're starting a new political party and we want to run for office in Ireland, they literally wouldn't allow us to do it. And also, they fund the political parties, so that the government itself funds the parties that are competing. This is, again, the ghost of Odie Madden smiles somewhere. This is racket behavior. The second part of the racket are the NGOs, which I didn't even touch on. We have tens of thousands of them, 36,000? Yeah. NGOs. And what is an NGO but a mechanism for the government to do the things that are forbidden to it by the Constitution? And they are lavishly supported, and the kickbacks between the two of them are astounding. And the third leg of the stool is the media, which also is funded by the government, which allows zero conservative thought to penetrate. Popular entertainment, programming, late-night talk shows, the news, everything is the party line. It actually makes the old Warsaw Pact look liberal compared to Ireland. So you've got to start with that. And the way they're trying to start is with the media. But that's a very long road to hoe, and I'm not sure that that's the most successful way to do it. Luckily, I just get to criticize. I don't have to actually do anything. Okay.
The second element in your argument is that the political structure in Ireland has become ossified, and it's now so different in the attitudes of the people, but is still able to assemble because of for the reasons you gave a moment ago, still able to assemble an electoral majority of a shrinking kind on election day. I think anyone who follows politics in Europe as a whole can see what I'd call the disease of grand coalitionism creeping everywhere, including the European Parliament, because, of course, if you have two-party systems in which the two parties gradually begin to agree, they are doing so because their joint interests are under serious threat from electoral trends. So again, what you've got to do if you're going to do anything here is in all of these countries, but particularly in Britain as well as Ireland, and particularly presumably in the north, you've got to find some way. I mean, where this kind of coalitionism is actually legally enforced. I mean, that's what the Good Friday Agreement is. It is agreement that it will not be democratic choice, but that governments in which completely opposite opposing parties, which have got radically different opinions of what to do, they're all forced to serve in the same administration. I mean, it is an absurdity, really, and only makes sense as a way of proceeding from civil war on the one hand, to some kind of government by discussion, debate, and cooperation. Okay. How do you get rid of that in all of these countries? As you said, we couldn't start a party.
Well, it's so hard to break through this sort of iron curtain of stupidity that characterizes Ireland. But I go back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is Ireland's never been a country. Now, Hungary is a completely different example because 2/3 of your former territory is now in somebody else's country. So you've seen that here, and you've seen some parts of it as spoils of war, spoils of World War II in this particular case. And yet, I've been impressed at how there's still Hungarian nationalism in, for example, Western Romania. And Prime Minister Orban recognizes that, and those people can vote in Hungarian elections, which I think is good. I suggest that the diaspora be given a vote in Irish politics, because if 40 million of us, very successful people, wealthy people, people of great influence, far beyond anything, get involved in Irish politics, it will change that country overnight. It's again, I go back to the notion of the animosity between the stay-at-homes and the leavers. There's a nasty joke, which I mention on the air all the time in Ireland, which wins me no friends whatsoever. But the saying is, the smart ones got on the boat and the stupid ones stayed home. The way that the native Irish see this is, you fled when we suffered. So you take your money and your fancy lifestyle and your big tract houses and get out. We don't want to see you ever again. And there's got to be a way. That has to get bridged first. But I would give the diaspora, like you and me, a say in the country, since it's never been a country. It's only a nation, and it's in so many different countries around the world.
I'm going to throw open the debate to the floor in a moment, but one other point. Let us take the question of the other half of your solution. Ireland becomes, in effect, a vanguard within a politics rooted in the Anglosphere. And the Anglosphere, for practical purposes, if we look at other writers who've discussed this at length, is essentially the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Now, there are countries which you could say are candidate members of the Anglosphere or partly members of the Anglosphere. The biggest example, of course, is India, which has an English language political culture as well as a strongly Hindu one. But also smaller countries like Singapore could obviously be members of the Anglosphere.
Or Japan.
Or Israel, in fact, which is, again, an English-speaking as well as a Hebrew-speaking country. So there is an interesting idea here, and these countries are tending to cooperate in politics, partly because the official international legal and political structure centered around organizations like the United Nations and the EU tends to be hostile to them. Look at the arguments between Israel on the one hand and the ICC on the other. that being said, when I've ever been in a country in which the Anglosphere was the topic of discussion, the Irish in that country have always been what you might call, well, hopefully, the loyal opposition in the country. That's certainly true, for example, in Australia. It's true in British Columbia, in Canada. The French are the other, not quite loyal opposition. And of course, in the British Isles, the Irish are, so to speak, the opposition as well, because not only do they break away from the UK, but also their influence in British politics tends to be to support other Celtic fringe rebellions. So the question is, how secure, how stable would an Anglosphere built around an Irish vanguard be?
Well, that's a problem, because the Irish have never been self-determinative, and they've never had the chance to. I do think that the Anglosphere is successful precisely because of the British influence, because of colonialism, because that, for example, in North and South America, the British colonized America. Britain sent hundreds of thousands of people to populate the land. And the reason we don't speak French is the French did not. They exploited, they made treaties with some of the Indian tribes, and they sent priests and mercantilists, but they didn't send people. Though Latin America was different. The Spanish came as conquistadores, and they kept their Spanish bloodline very, very pure. Of course, from the start, with Cortés, who had an Indian mistress, he had the first mestizo child, and it's the mestizos who have inherited South America and Mexico, essentially. But the British colonization gave birth to all of these great Anglospheric nations. So what I think that has to happen is the Irish have to forget the past. They have to forget the English. They have to forget the famine. They have to forget all that went through. That's over with now. It's time to really move on and understand where your loyalties lie. They don't lie with Napoleonic France and its overly bureaucratized system of government, which the EU is a good example of. They're much more like Jeffersonian democracy, which is a more effective and flexible way of governing a country. But they have to let the past go.
Okay. Well, my final question then would be, you're making the Irish face up to a choice, which is a particularly difficult one. And that choice is to choose between the Anglosphere and Europe, because the fact is the Irish political class is Europhiliac, not Europhile, it's Europhiliac. And that political class is determined to emphasize the European aspects of British identity and to move gradually away, not only from the connection with Britain, one can see why that might happen, but also, as you've said, from the connection with America. And that was a very important connection, among other things, keeping alive Irish republicanism all these years. So, again, I think that's a very interesting idea. How practical is it? And who are by which I mean, who are the political leaders in all of the countries, but particularly in Ireland, you see, who might emerge and take up the standard you have unfurled for them?
Well, I don't see anyone in Ireland right now. Ireland has a complex. What a derogatory term for an Irishman is paddy. It's not derogatory in Ireland. Paddy over there. It's just a generic term for your man. But paddy will accept any amount of suffering. He will grumble, but then he'll give him a shovel and he'll dig a ditch again. So the most talented, this is a very odd place, Ireland, because the most talented people were either sent into exile, executed, or fled, and became the military class of France, for example. The French army in the 19th century was heavily Irish in its officer corps. The United States, I've made the same point. Australia, you had the convicts who were Irishmen transported as far away as they could possibly go. So you've got to bring this nationalistic feeling together. But as John just said, if Europhiliac doesn't begin to describe them. They now see we're Europeans. We're just like the French. We're just like the Germans. And when people like me say, if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have a country in the first place. Because guess who gave you that money? Guess who sold you those arms? Guess who supported you? Guess who put pressure on the British government? Us. That's who, us. And that is not a lesson that they want to acknowledge right now.
Unfortunately, we don't have the two great patron saints of your policy, who are Terry Wogan, the man who became the most popular man in England as an Irish broadcaster. So he's the popular representative of your argument. And the other was Conor Cruise O'Brien, a man who originally began life as a historian and a leader as a diplomat in the anti-partition cause, but then ended it as the editor of The Observer and one of the most important critics of physical false nationalism in Irish politics. Okay, now I've said that, let me ask, I know we have several Irish people or Irish-derived people, and I know we have at least one other Ulster Unionist in the room, so can I ask, would you raise your hand, please, if you'd like to raise a question? This gentleman here. The other Ulster Unionist.
Yeah. Some of the language, I mean, there was one phrase used, it would be great if we just annexed the north of Ireland. That's obviously something that...
Provocative?
Would cause a few problems, I think. I think what gets me is nationalists generally look at the partition and think it was a great injustice, as opposed to being the best possible solution at the time, because you had 1 million Unionists armed to the teeth back from the Battle of the Somme. It would have been rather messy. And I still think partition is the best solution for the moment. Maybe down the line, some generations pass, everybody forgets history, which I think is very important, but it's all a bit fresh.
Well, it's happening. It's demography is destiny, as our mutual friend Mark Stein likes to say. And there are now only 2 counties with Protestant majorities, and no sensible there's no border, so we do have a problem right now because of the Good Friday Agreement and the no border. With Britain having pulled out of the EU, immigrants come to England where they're welcomed aboard by the Starmer administration, and then they come across to Belfast, and then they just come right down into the Republic of Ireland. So the Republic has no border controls of any kind right now, and many of these million people have come through this porous, non-existent border. If Ireland really wanted to unify, you could it's an island. You can't walk to it. So it would be a much more defensible place. But right now, it's the worst of all possible worlds, I think.
Of course, from the British standpoint, the same thing could happen in reverse. If we decided to have a tough restrictionist migration policy, it could be undone by people going to Ireland and then to the north.
Yes, and just there's literally no even sign. It changes from kilometers to miles at one point. I don't know any Irishman who really does understand kilometers. That seems to me to be a French sort of thing, but it's on the road signs.
Certainly rationalist, isn't it, Jeff? Yes, the lady here, the second row. Oh, did you have we'll come back.
No, go ahead. Thank you. First thing I'd say is that most Irish people in America are Protestant. So your thoughts give me an idea of some red-hot evangelical Presbyterians getting involved in Irish politics. And I think that won't be happy. But that's another problem. The other point is that when you use phrases like Anglosphere and reminding the Irish that they're not European, you have to understand that when the chance to go into the EU came up, it was a moment for the Irish to be something other than a person who was not English. They could be European, rather than just being a sort of provincial British.
But they rejected the treaty the first time, and they were told to vote again until you get it right, Patty.
Well, no, they went into the EU. They had two other
They
treaties.
were in the economic union, but this
Yeah.
notion of
Yeah.
becoming part of what I now term the EU-SSR,
the early
they had
days,
to vote twice on it.
They were. I know. I was one of the people who had to vote twice there. But the early days when they went into what became the EU, they were delighted because now there's something besides not an Englishman, and you have to understand that emotional attachment. I agree with you that the country is diabolically run, but to say, come and join the Anglosphere, well, they take advantage of that with their indirect foreign investment because they're English speaking, which is great for all those companies. But to say to them to go back over and call themselves Anglosphere, I think it would be too emotional. I don't think that would work.
I think that's a good point, but I do recommend that we get over the animosity to Britain and not just Ireland has a tendency to whatever the Brits do, we're going to do the exact opposite. That'll show them, right? But all it ends up doing is we shoot ourselves in the foot. So you have a dysfunctional country that's a rump state that is a government that is prone to corruption. We just had listen, I don't think most people don't know this. Every one of these people minister for this and that. It's a dictatorship of ministers. And each ministry has a collection of unrelated portfolios. So we just have a woman who's failed as justice minister, failed as education minister, is now the minister for defense, the minister for commerce, the minister for pencils and paper clips, the minister for what's on TV tomorrow. Whatever it is, it goes in this little portmanteau bag. And you have a dwindling number of people running the country with these multiple portfolios. One of them just left his office after having given an enormous grant to the World Bank and took a job with the World Bank. And now he's got a cushy gig in Belgium somewhere, and he'll never work another day in his life. So that's a racket. I'm sorry, that's what it is.
Yes, the gentleman here. David. As one of the other Ulster Unionists in the room, and indeed the Anglosphere,
I'm surrounded.
And indeed the Anglosphere Fellow of the Danube Institute. I think the fundamental flaw with your, besides the lexicon, with your assumption of the North is not demographic but financial. The South cannot afford the North. Because
yes.
It is currently more than 50% public sector employed. The dependency on the NHS is enormous. The lifestyle diseases and the prevalence thereof make what is already a bad case on the mainland of Britain look absolutely paltry in comparison. And every Irishman I've ever spoken to on this question, even though they may in essence be sympathetic to the idea of unification, on a purely practical ground says we're never going to do it. Not least because young people, if given a vote on this, knowing the facts of this case, would be viciously against it because it would undermine their quality of life. And I don't know how one goes about resurrecting the economic life of the North, but it certainly wouldn't be to the detriment of the South.
Well, I think that's a very good point. I would just say, as someone who was in Berlin when the wall came down, up to the moment the wall came down, everybody said this will never happen. And then it did. And you know what? It was gone a few months later. I've told this story elsewhere, but I was in East Germany in 1985 on the 40th anniversary of the destruction of Dresden by Anglo-Amerikanische Bomber, where we completely, as a war crime, destroyed a city that had no military usefulness whatsoever. Then I was in Russia in 1986 when Chernobyl blew up. I was on tour with Vladimir Horowitz, the great pianist, and we were in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. And I came back after my first experience with the Soviet Union. I went back many times, but I felt this is a dead country. It cannot go on. It cannot go on. And I would talk to the American intelligence people who were thick on the ground there, and I said, "Look at this place. It's dysfunctional on so many levels." And they said, "No, it will never change." And then I went back to the United States. I was on the radio in the fall of '86, and I said, I predict that Germany will be reunited within 5 years. And I was wrong. It was 3. So it happens. When it happens, it just happens. And your arguments are absolutely right. And the South can't afford the North. England itself doesn't really love the North. It's a kind of an ugly red-headed stepchild at this point. But I just think that it's, you just look at a map, I do think it's going to happen.
Yes, next question is the gentleman here.
Well, as someone from the people who didn't get on the boat, the stupid people of Ireland.
Now I'm in trouble even with my home.
Not at all. I was going to say, I agree with you on the principle of the United Ireland, but in Northern Ireland there is no democracy. There's mandatory coalitions between parties which are divided by community. So there's no democracy. The fundamental principle of democracy is the majority principle. We can't have that in Northern Ireland. All the ministries, I've lived in Belfast for 5 years, all the ministries are divided by community, except for justice, because that's the only one where you absolutely couldn't have a Catholic in justice. That's too important. So that's always goes to alliance.
By the way, I would live in Belfast before I'd live in Dublin any day of the week. Much nicer city than Dublin.
I agree with that, and it's a more Irish city as well. But that's another conversation for another time. But I wanted to ask you about the flag, actually, of Ireland and what you think of it, the tricolour, because, and I don't want your aesthetic opinion on its design, but what it represents, the green, the white and the orange. I'll just give you my own opinion very quickly so that you can kind of respond to it. I think there are flaws with it. The first is obviously that 1 million Protestants see it as the flag of the enemy, although it might have good intentions, and if people don't know, what it means is the green represents the kind of Gaelic, Catholic Irish, the white is peace between them, and the orange, Protestant Irish. The flaw I see in it as well is that it actually suggests that there are two nations. So it's not something that people of any religion, Irishmen of Protestant, Catholic background, can look at and think, that's the flag that represents me. It actually says it's a coexistence kind of thing, so it's a little bit awkward. It says that there's two nations and we try not to kill each other. In the case that there was a United Ireland, would you support changing the flag? And do you have any ideas on?
Yeah, I'd love to see the harp.
Harp, yeah.
I'm a big fan of the harp. I think that would be it's a lovely symbol. What other country has a musical instrument as its main symbol? I see your point about the dichotomistic nature of the flag, and you understand how it was meant, but now the far right, as they call us, well, we have an Irish flag in our porch. We have an American flag in our porch too. I think, in a way, Ireland is facing the same thing on a religious basis and partly ethnic basis, as the Americans did with the integration of black people into the 12% of the population that was black post-Civil War. We get focused on the racial thing a lot, but we lived in Germany for many years, and I remember thinking one night, walking down the street, there were TVs when they had TVs in those days, and they were on, and there was an American baseball game. And it was dark, and it was wet, and typical German. And there was one other guy there, and he was black. And I realized, to the Germans, we're two Americans. We're not a white guy and a black guy. We're Americans watching a baseball game far from home. And it was much harder to travel than in 1980s. But what unifies us is more important than these things that divide us. And I think the flag might be an interesting way to get around that. The Carolyn harp is just a great Irish symbol.
Perhaps I could ask the last question or a question. Obviously, your remarks about the character of the Northern Ireland constitutional settlement, I think I said something very similar in my opening gambit there. They are modelled, in essence, on the Lebanon, and all places in where you have what seems to be an irreconcilable majority-minority split, because it's not simply an electoral split. In an election, majorities and minorities change shape and composition all the time, but they don't change shape and composition in a racially or religiously divided society. Now, you might solve that problem, United Ireland might solve that problem in the north, but only at the cost of establishing it in the whole of Ireland, surely. Otherwise, you're going to have elections which produce governments which, a government which is hated by the opposition and therefore tempted always to reduce its power. It's supposing to impose penalties on its voters, and vice versa.
Plus, Lebanon has fallen apart, and I think we should make the note that under this constitution, a Catholic had to be the president, right? Yeah, and then a Muslim was, however they apportioned power. But again, demography takes over, and there are many fewer Catholics. What is Lebanon actually? It's the old Crusader state. That's exactly what it is. The Kingdom of Galilee, or the Principality of Antioch. But that's 1,000 years in the past now. So Lebanon is effectively a Muslim country at this point, no matter what the Constitution says.
But it wasn't actually. It was more or less 50-50 or near it.
It was, yeah.
But how do you solve the problem for Ireland if you still have a religiously and/or ethnically divided community, and that hasn't faded away into insignificance?
I do think the government is trying to get to that in its own bass-ackwards way, which is by secularizing Ireland, it becomes less Catholic. So it's not the Catholic opposition to Henry VIII and the Archbishop of Canterbury anymore. And they're trying to dilute that aspect of Irish nationalism. But I am a great follower of Camille Paglia, the American all-around genius, in my opinion. And Camille's point has always been, whether it's about the Marquis de Sade or politics or ancient Egypt, is if you suppress something, it just makes it come back more virulent when it comes back, and then it bites you. So that's the danger we're facing here.
Well, I'm a big fan of Camille Paglia too, and I think maybe we should send her several books on Ireland and ask her to come up with a solution to it. But just before we move on, obviously, to both parts of Ireland, and therefore to Ireland as a whole, immigration has now brought in a third player in the game. Now, that player is actually itself multi-ethnic. I mean, they're from several different countries. But what is going to happen in an island which is trying to bring together still not fully reconciled Catholics and Protestants, and Northerners and Southerners, because that itself is increasingly a divide, with the Northerners for about 40 years complaining, why aren't you doing more for us? And the Southerners saying, you deserve everything you get. And how are we going to, and they're saying that to fellow Catholics very often too, when particularly outrageous thing was done by the IRA. So, again, I see, both for Britain and Ireland actually, a very worrying prospect that the Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland settlement produced by the Good Friday Agreement may be replicable across both countries if we carry on as we are now.
Just to that point, we tend to think the division in Ireland between North and South, but it's actually a division between East and West. And the East, as I mentioned in my talk, is the old British Pale of Settlement and the much greater Anglo influence on the east of Ireland. The west of Ireland is Celtic Ireland. It's primitive Ireland. It's Irish-speaking Ireland. The Gaeltachts are close by. As I mentioned, my own family didn't speak English until they got to the United States. And that brings in ethno-nationalism as well. And the Irish government's trying to suppress that. The Dublin Castle is just where the British administration used to operate out from, as a sort of loaded term. But to Dublin Castle, with the suppression of the Celts is a very important thing, and that Ireland become more anglicized and make the world England. Now that all these lids are off the bottles and the genies are coming out.
Well, to Dublin Castle and suppression of the Celts is very much what they're doing. So, okay, another question, gentleman there.
Thank you. So I've got a lot of friends in Ireland. I'm going there later this week. And recently there was, I think it was last year, a survey across the EU asking young people whether they plan to leave their countries within the next 3 years. And Ireland had the highest number, with over 60% of people under 25 saying they would like to or plan to leave the country within the next 3 years. So what do you think about the phenomenon of smart young people, ambitious young people, entrepreneurial young people wanting to leave Ireland, not just as a thing of the past, but as an ongoing
I think the government actually wants that because it's traditionally Irish to export your talent. That's what we're good at. We don't really manufacture anything. The EU-SSR is going to strangle our farmers because they'd rather import beef from Brazil. How did you all love the COP30 thing? They bulldozed 1,000 miles of Amazon rainforest burning down in the middle of the climate change. I thought that was absolutely an evil and whying thing to do. They like exporting their people. Young people in Ireland feel that they're now feeling oppressed, that the Ukrainians get a leg up, the Africans get a leg up, everybody gets a leg up. People get to Ireland on a plane and they get on the plane with a passport and they get off the plane with no passport. They destroy their documents. And the Irish government lets them in. It doesn't turn them around, send them home on the next plane. It just says, you have to give me asylum. I'm a refugee. We know that 90% of them are economic main chancers that are coming for the handouts. So the young Irish people say, why do I have to put up with this? I've got cousins in Australia. I hear Melbourne's great. I think I'll go there and get a job. And then the Irish government says, look, we don't have any young people anymore. We need to import nurses from India. So you're watching them. The replacement migration theory actually is in action in Ireland as the population is going to be replaced, and the Irish will do what we always do, which will go somewhere else and make a success of it. But the young people that can't buy a house, property values are through the roof in Dublin especially, and they feel like they're last in line for any job. So it's a very discouraging prospect, and I believe that is true. Those surveys are really reflecting Irish public opinion.
Could I ask the question, where were Britain and Hungary in the list of countries?
I can check. I actually have, I think, the list here. So Ireland's number 1. Number 2 is Cyprus, with around, so Ireland was a bit over 60%. Cyprus is 55%. Hungary's number 3, with around 53%. Next is Spain, Italy, Greece, Belgium, Malta, Poland, Sweden, Austria.
Oh.
I would say, can I guess, if Hungarians will correct me, I don't think that the young Hungarians are dissatisfied with their country, but that it's been reduced to such a small fraction of what it once was. They hope to use their talents in a much wider context than just one small country, where the Irish kids are literally being forced to leave. You're invited to go. Thanks. Have a nice day. Right if you get work. I think that's a different, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Hungarians can tell me.
Gentleman here.
I just looked up the population of Northern Ireland because I wasn't sure about it. It's 2 million people. Now, you're telling me that there's 2 million guests in Southern Ireland. Is that correct?
It's 1 million plus.
1 million plus, or
Yeah.
a little bit more perhaps, but it's almost the same as the population of Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the Irish are fighting each other, okay, and one's Protestant, one's Catholic, but with 1 million other people embedded in there who are neither.
Right. Now there
Okay,
is.
so there's a problem there.
Yes.
All right. I mean, I can understand where, as time goes by, that 1 million plus will become 2 million plus. So
Well, the
how
old
do you-
paradigms are over. That's what I keep trying to come back to, is
So
that we've got to get over this traditional way of thinking of the divisions.
aside from an active revolution, all right, how do you propose to handle that? I mean, how are you going to get rid of the criminals that are running the country? Like, as the same as in Ukraine. I'm not going to attack you, but
Yeah.
same as in Ukraine, the criminals are running the country,
Yeah.
supported by the EU and the United States, because they want a piece of Russia. Okay, but let's not get into that at this point. But the other thing I was thinking of is the downfall of Southern Ireland occurred with the downfall of the church, because the church was an alternate form of government. That's the way I look at it.
The church represented the nation, the Irish nation, in opposition to Britain, which had become Protestant. So there was that as well. It's interesting to note that the population of Ireland in 1830 was 8 million. By the time the famine had run its course, with 1 million people starved to death, 1 million people emigrating, the population eventually dropped to 4 million. So it's an example of a country whose population was, without any diminution in territory, halved within someone's lifetime. And one of the arguments that the EU-SSR now makes is, well, look at all this space you have. We could put another 5 to 10 million people. We could get Ireland back up to 8 million people overnight. Just let them come in and build them houses. And the Irish are saying, well, we don't want to do that. So it's a very sticky wicket they're playing at the moment.
Yes, Kate. Kate.
This is the real expert in our family here on Ireland.
Living there full time, just going along with what you just said about the negative attitude of the current Irish government. Living there full time now, as I do, and just trying to look at the political situation calmly and without being emotional about it. But it's hard to think anything except that the current government kind of hates the people there, because they don't do anything good. The relentless importation of people who aren't Irish, and the aggressive handouts for everything, for education, for medical attention, for housing, for just pocket money. It's kind of astounding. The globalists, and it's been about 10 years that we've been there full time, and the change that I've seen. And listening to Michael and realizing that the whole idea is, it's a very, very good idea. But the crux right now is, how can it come about with the current government that's so I think they're anti-Irish.
They are anti-Irish. There's no loathing like self-loathing, as many different kinds of people around the world. This is why I'm advocating scrapping the whole thing. I think it needs kind of a peace and reconciliation commission that would offer it a new form of government and territorial integrity. And I think that its salvation lies in the Anglosphere, not with Paris or Berlin.
Michael, you're advocating something much more dramatic than that solution confined to Ireland. Because, of course, one of the most obvious characteristics of modern advanced democracies is not that the people hate the government, but that the government hates the people. And you can see it in a country after country after country. Why is that? I think it's a very interesting question, and I'm sure there are several answers to it. One is, of course, that the government begins to feel much more fellow sympathy with fellow governments and fellow bureaucrats around the world, and the people keep presenting them with difficult-to-solve problems which they don't want to deal with anyway. So that, I think, is one of the most striking features of the modern world. It takes us beyond the 6 counties and indeed the 32 counties and to the problems of all societies, and it's something to which, although a lot of clever people are now increasingly aware of it, we don't as yet have a solution. Maybe Ireland will be the country that leads us to that solution. We must keep our fingers crossed. Thank you very much indeed.
That's the Brechtian solution. Instead of dissolving the government, why doesn't the government just dissolve the people and elect a new one? Thank you very much for coming, everyone.